Hello and welcome to this week's Spiked podcast. My name is Hugo Timms. I'm a staff writer at Spiked. I'm delighted to be joined as always by Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Claire Fox from the Academy of Ideas. Hello, Claire.
Hello, both of you.
Last Friday, we awoke to the news that Ann Widdecombes, the long-time Conservative MP and the current Reform spokesperson for immigration, was dead. By Friday afternoon, we learnt that she had not died in her home in Dartmoor on Thursday as a result of natural causes or by an accident, but she had in fact been murdered. On Friday afternoon, Devon and Cornwall police had a press conference. It was a long-delayed press conference. They told us that they had apprehended a 26-year-old suspect and that there was no political motive in her murder that they could discern.
No, at this time, again, it's early stages of the investigation, so we'll remain open-minded. At this time, I've got no information to believe that that is a politically motivated crime.
A 28-year-old man from Rotherham is now in custody, and a political motive is very much in the frame.
Counter-Terrorism South East are now leading the investigation into the death of Ann Widdecombes. It is clear that this was a targeted attack.
Claire, you wrote a touching piece for us on Spiked this week about your friendship with Ann Widdecombes and your time together as Brexit Party MEPs. There is a lot to unpack in this story. What have you made of it?
This started off as a tragic accident as far as the friends were concerned. I was getting messages saying that she died. And because various of us had seen her relatively recently, and she was fit as a fiddle, you just thought it was a heart attack or a stroke or something. And so that was tragic enough, because these days 78 is young to die, especially when somebody's quite so lively and vivacious and active on the political scene, somebody who was sharp as a tack in all of the interviews she did. So we were all shocked. And then as it emerged, that story of violence being involved, it was inevitable, I think, that we would think straight away as a high profile and controversial political figure that maybe it was some kind of political killing. Maybe it was a burglary gone wrong. Maybe it was a political killing. But very quickly we were being shouted at and hectored by the police that we weren't allowed to consider one of those options. We had to say it had absolutely nothing to do with politics. Anyone who speculated was being told off. And the police, had started off that tone. But then a variety of particularly media commentators and other political figures started saying anyone who suggests that this had anything to do with terrorism or anything to do with politics is politicizing this whole issue. And so that kind of just made it worse. I mean, the police didn't need to have said, they just really didn't need to have said there was no political motive. They should have said, we don't know what's happened yet, which is fair enough. They were very clear to want to tell us that this was a white 26-year-old and then white male 26-year-old and then a different white male 28-year-old. But any of the speculation was then seen to be, and we were told, irresponsible, going to completely jeopardize the case. And as fact, and of course, that I think that just created a really unpleasant atmosphere that people who knew Anne or concerned about it, or people who just admired her, who wanted to just ask the question, well, was this politically motivated, were immediately themselves demonized in some way. That became the focus. Because this is run alongside a controversy over Nigel Farage receiving £5 million from Chris Harborne, which he had initially said the money was to give him security, and there was already a kind of to-do, a big political to-do about that. There were people who drew the conclusion, well, maybe Anne was murdered, and in fact that's subsequently what we now know to be the case, that somehow then this became according to some members of the commentariat, Reform UK distracting from the £5 million and justifying that. I mean, the whole thing became very tangled up. And I think that as a consequence of all of this kind of rather toxic atmosphere around the discussion, two things are true. One is that it's been harder to just express grief and just how shocking it is that somebody of 78 would be killed, and that somehow it involved anti-terrorism police and had a targeted political motive attached to it, but that you wanted to be grieving about it and angry about it and furious about it, and that people were all the time trying to police your emotions, and that also the poor communications on behalf of the police undoubtedly have just led to a far more kind of conspiratorial kind of bad faith atmosphere around the discussion, and I've found that really unpleasant.
Keeping an independent publication going also means thinking about how you turn what you've built into something people can support and buy into. Whether that's books, event tickets, merchandise, or subscriptions, you want the experience to feel as professional as the work behind it. And that's exactly what we were looking for. Something to build, easy for customers to use, and ready to handle the moment someone decides to buy. That's where Shopify comes in. It gives a business a professional storefront from day one, with a quick, straightforward checkout that makes it easy for customers to buy and come back again. Because Shopify handles the setup and checkout, you have more time to focus on growing your business and the tools to do it. So you can spend more time focusing on what you're actually trying to build, rather than worrying about how people are going to buy from you. With Shopify, nothing stands between your idea and a real business, so go and make it one. Start your free trial at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Start your free trial once again at shopify.co.uk/spiked. One more time, shopify.co.uk/spiked.
Tom, what have you made to the response to Ann Widdecombes' murder?
Well, I suppose there's two things I'm particularly struck by. The first was the overwhelming sense of shock, horror at what had happened, and deep affection towards Ann Widdecombe. You saw that across the board. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who was struck to find that people who probably would never have dreamed of voting either for the Conservative Party or Reform still held her in tremendously high esteem. I think that really spoke to her as a person, the impact, the mark she had left on not just political life, but kind of British cultural life in a kind of post-parliamentary career in reality television and Strictly and Big Brother and so on and so forth.
How does it feel to be a finalist?
Well, I think it's rather surprising. I mean, when I consider that I'm a pensioner and the defender of the unborn and traditional marriage and the Roman Catholic Church, all of which are unfashionable views, and that I am the scourge of political correctness and general snowflakery and emotional incontinence, I think it's rather surprising that I'm still here.
She became that very rare thing, which was a right-wing Conservative who became a national treasure. You don't often get those these days. And Rory Sutherland made this point on Twitter, but I think it's very true. I think Ann Widdecombe belonged to a sort of increasingly fading line of politicians, left and right. You know, everyone from your Dennis Skinners through to your Tony Benns, through to your Ann Widdecombes, who were irascible, who were formidable, but who were respected precisely because they stuck to their principles. People who would never dream of giving a speech, reading off of their phone or dispensing with lines to take in the media. People who, even if you disagree with them quite bitterly, you could respect. And that seems to be a kind of politician that our culture is increasingly incapable of producing in so many ways. So that was really quite striking, the kind of bipartisan sense of what a loss this was. But then, of course, there was the fringe, but nevertheless pretty noisy response from people who were initially expressing a kind of mirth at her demise. I mean, this was before we found out about the suspected murder, let alone terror charges. But just even in response to the news itself, there was that Socialist Worker headline saying, "Hurrah, Ann Widdecombe is strictly dead." Of course, there was the comments that the veteran LGBT activist Peter Tatchell made, where even without a kind of modicum of throat clearing or thoughts and prayers, just said she was a bigot because of her various socially conservative views on gay rights and gay marriage over the years. And then, of course, that was a very strange spectacle of Adam Bolton on Sky News, who, when he was sort of killing time in between the police updates and everything else, just decided to start pontificating about how she was a spinster and an old maid.
She was very much a spinster. I mean, by the end, I think you probably describe her as an old maid. Reportedly, she claimed that she was a virgin.
It would be kind of impossible to imagine, should some of the details be reversed, whether it's a Labour MP, say, who had died and maybe lived a bit of a carefree life, that people would hop on television and start talking about how she used to get about a bit. I mean, it would be unthinkable, but that's sort of what took place. So even though that was something which certainly didn't define how I think the country has responded to Ann Widdecombes' death, now suspected murder, I think it did speak to sort of what we saw in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, this way in which right wing is not just kind of fair game for demonisation when they are here, but even when the worst happens to them, it's greeted with a sort of level of inhumanity, which I think stems from a kind of intolerance that exists in our political culture. But I think that even as the dust settles, even as we're waiting to see what comes out of this investigation, the part of that response that we should hold on to and that has been the most overwhelming is what a loss this has been and how strongly that's been felt by people across the country.
If I could just chip in there, I think that one of the reasons why Ann Widdecombes stands out in terms of a politician of some distinction was that she was prepared to hold unpopular views. And in the face of overwhelming hostility to her unpopular views, Ann Widdecombe was very enthusiastic about banning fox hunting. And she was in the Conservative Party that really was opposed to that ban.
What I am against is the chase. It is the cruelty involved in prolonging the terror of a living, sentient being which is running for its life.
And this was what stands out to me about Anne, where she would be prepared to hold unpopular views, unfashionable views, and that sometimes would be on things which I wouldn't agree with her on her views on abortion. Some of her views on prisons and so on were pretty hard line. But she that unpopularity didn't make her sway. Now, when you think that we are in an era of opportunism, of people, of prime ministers bending to their backbenchers, of going with the wind and so on, I think that's what really made her stand out. And guess what's been revealed by her death? That actually politicians from all parties actually admire people who stick with unpopular views. In the end, even if you don't agree with them, you really respect that. But I think it has also thrown up, and I think maybe we'll talk about it separately, but a problem for free speeches that I know that Spiked are and certainly at the Academy of Ideas we are, which is this very uncomfortable idea that the reaction to some of the absolutely vile, inhumane, fringe views, but I think it's been explained that, expressed on mainstream television, like the queer environmentalist activist who was on Politics Live, being incredibly unpleasant about Ann Widdecombe.
I feel like even though what's happened is absolutely awful, there are a lot of people who won't be grieving this.
Nigel, do you think that's fair at a time when she's...
To be honest, I'm a bit shocked to hear that. I think that's completely inappropriate, and I think you will regret what you just said there.
I'm just stating the facts of her political career.
Or Adam Bolton, as you've described, this completely cavalier, I can't put too fine a point on it, sexist discussion about Ann Widdecombe and so on. But then that with some of the more extreme views, suddenly people who loved Anne, or people around reform, some of them at least, are saying these people are putting out horrible things on social media. They should be banned. Go and arrest them. This is absolutely disgusting. And you think, just hold on. Think of the Lucy Connolly test. Do you know what I mean? I mean, the trans activist from Aberdeen University has just been arrested and charged for a very unpleasant attack on Anne, saying that he pretends to be he saying that he hoped that Ann Widdecombe had suffered and been tortured before she did that kind of thing, right? Absolutely vile. But is this a matter of the criminal law? And there's a real split on it. And I want to just emphasize that one of the things that Ann Widdecombes and I agreed on was free speech. And I think it's really pretty telling that whether it was Joe Cox or whether it was David Amess or whether it's Ann Widdecombes, the government and the state are too keen to say, let's clamp down on social media and let's bring in an element of censorship as a way of responding to these things. And that was indeed what Lucy Powell, she of the grooming gangs or dog whistle or racist dog whistle fame, she immediately said, I was a great admirer of Ann Widdecombes. Let's clamp down on social media. We need more restrictions.
We do need to tackle some of the online algorithms and business models which heighten this kind of polarisation and hate towards those in public life. And we must do more to tackle this with urgency.
But even in the kind of populist masses, people are too keen to say, well, I don't care. Because Ann Widdecombes was our politician, we should now go around and persecute and prosecute people who are being vile about her. And we have to hold our nerve. And it's an unpopular opinion. And therefore take our lead, if you want, from Ann Widdecombes sticking with her unpopular opinion and saying, no, this is my unpopular opinion. I'm not trying to ban anyone who's got one, and I don't want to be banned for mine.
If you have an opinion, it does not matter whether it is popular or unpopular. It does not matter whether it is right or wrong. It does not matter whether it is left or right. If it is your opinion, you should be able to utter it in a free society.
But no, I think Claire is absolutely right, of course, that it's at times like this that you have to hold the line on freedom of speech, almost more so, because in moments of sort of national shock, there's always people who are going to reach for the censorship. It's been striking how, I mean, certainly in the wake of David Amess's murder by an Islamist terrorist, the reflex to clamp down on social media seemed largely to be a sort of displacement activity. We'd rather not talk about the Islamist threat. That's something which we don't want to go near. We worried it will gin people up into some kind of Islamophobic fury. So it became a discussion about people being mean to MPs on social media. And whilst maybe the impulse for why we're having a discussion about clamping down on speech online and off in the wake of Ann Widdecombes might be coming from a slightly different place, it also just doesn't solve the problem. The fact that, social media can be a bit of a sewer at the best of times, but particularly if you're a politician or someone in public life, it's particularly impossible to ignore, and it does seem to be getting worse at the edges in some respects. That is not the reason why we have horrific incidents like this. You have to make a really firm distinction between words and actions, otherwise you get into all kinds of trouble. I think the difficulty is, in contrast to, say, America, where after Charlie Kirk's assassination, it was, broadly speaking, cancel culture, which was where you saw the authoritarian impulse play out. It was people getting sacked from their perches on CNN, or even sacked from their jobs just in everyday life because they had said something on social media that they shouldn't have. They celebrated his murder, or they laughed at it, or what have you. Because they have the First Amendment, that wasn't something that became a criminal issue. The issue here is that in the UK, we have all manner of laws that could be used in order to clamp down on people who might be seen to celebrate someone's death. Obviously, there's a case in Scotland which is tricky to talk about now that charges have been brought. But there was a case a few years ago, someone, I believe in Glasgow, who was prosecuted successfully for appearing to celebrate the death of Captain Tom Moore, just saying something absolutely despicable in the wake of that news. So it's all the more reason to hold the line, not least because we live in a country where it's not just people being sort of shamed and browbeaten for saying things that maybe they shouldn't have. It's also the fact that the law comes into place, which is really quite concerning. And just finally on the free speech case, I'm sure you'll have noticed this as well, Claire, there's a bit of like phony free speecherism which has kicked in as well, because people were hauling Adam Bolton over the coals or criticising the people for posting ghoulish things in the wake of Ann Widdecombes' death. I was saying, I thought you all believed in free speech. I think it's also important to remind people that getting pushback for saying something horrific is not an assault on your freedom of speech. And so that's another thing that we've got to hold firm to, because otherwise we're going to get ourselves into a right tangle when discussing this particular issue.
Where we get into tangles, I think, is where what I thought was there's a big debate now about whether all politicians need security and need to be protected. And I just want to raise an element of concern here. And this is not to undermine that certain politicians, be it somebody like Nigel Farage or any number of controversial politicians, undoubtedly do receive a disproportionate number of quite credible death threats, right? And I understand the seriousness of that. But now people are saying every politician needs to have 24/7 guards. And so the reason why I'm wary of this is because I work some of my life in the House of Lords, and they've just put up a huge metallic imposing fence that makes it look like a prison. This is apparently to protect us. And the problem is that it kind of constitutes, in my mind, a kind of barrier between public servants, i.e. politicians, and the public. And there is a real danger of kind of the tangle we get into here, where we end up saying politicians need to be protected from the public. And we have to be careful about going down that road. And I remember David Amess in particular, who had received death threats in the past, had said, well, I'm still going to do my surgeries regardless. I mean, we have to be careful about hiding away our politicians from the public. And I do remember during the whole Brexit furore, that there were some of the more fervent Remainiac MPs who said that when they were approached by people outside Parliament who were Brexiteers, who basically saying, we've had the referendum, we won, we've got to leave the EU. And then they were saying that they were intimidated and harassed, and it felt like a kind of violence. And it wasn't. It was, ordinary Brexit voters who were just basically so frustrated. How else could they talk to their politicians? So I just think somehow we've got to not overreact and kind of batten down the hatches in that way. That's one thing. The only other thing I wanted to say was, because I said it on the Spiked, very good Spiked documentary you did on Brexit as well, that those people who say that people are trying to politicise Ann Widdecombes' murder, which now appears to be politically driven or motivated. We've yet to understand the details of it. Some of those people were the very people who, when Joe Cox was brutally murdered in horrible circumstances by a mentally ill man who was undoubtedly somebody who hung around with the far right, I remember going on Any Questions 2 days after the murder and being told by a leading Guardian journalist that it was the Leave campaign's fault that she was murdered, that Leave was responsible for this. And that was a common thing to do. And then they had big ceremonies and people laying flowers and all the rest of it around Joe Cox. And it was very much, you lot have created this situation. When Reform tried to organise a service the other day in which they laid flowers, they were accused of opportunism, politicising the event, of trying to get themselves in the headlines. I mean, she was their friend, right? And then they said the family have asked that nobody should do. As it happens, her nephew, who she adored, and his wife were at that service. And why shouldn't they show respect to somebody that they loved and cared for? And Ann Widdecombe considered Reform to be her family.
She was a great colleague, loved by all of us that worked with her, even if, as I say at times, she would tell me I was wrong in terms of what I was doing, in no uncertain terms.
So I just think these things are multi-layered. We shouldn't be simplistic, and we should recognise that there are some bad faith actors around who actually, in their attempts at saying, don't make this a political issue, are actually trying to police our emotions, police our responses. And we should be open to discuss things like security of MPs. I'm not sure what we should do, but we can't be told there's only one answer. And that's both sides of an argument trying to say, if you don't think everybody should have a police guard at all times, that means you don't care about politician safety. That's nonsense. But conversely, those who say you're politicising it or that Reform are using it for wrong ends are also equally being unhelpful.
Let's talk about Andy Burnham. This week, it was confirmed he had the support of 350 MPs there or thereabouts. On Monday, he will replace Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. People are calling it a coronation. Is a coup a better word?
Well, I suppose it's a coup that. I mean, looking at that, the number of Labour politicians who rode in behind him, the kind of Kim Jong-un level of majority he seems to have commanded in that leadership election, it does give it it just shows a sort of overwhelming sort of conformism there is on this particular point. I understand that the Labour Party were sick to the back teeth of Keir Starmer. He had proven himself not only to diverged from a lot of the Labour backbenchers and a lot of the issues that they cared about, but was clearly an electoral liability that they were no longer willing to countenance. But the idea that Andy Burnham is so the answer that he should just be waved into not just the Labour leadership, but also the top job in British politics. The level of excitement, which is not only expressed by Labour MPs, but by the mainstream media, the liberal left leaning media, I just really don't get it. We've talked about it on the podcast before, we've written about it on the website. But Andy Burnham is a lot more like Keir Starmer than a lot of the critics would like him to believe. I mean, he has, of course, tacked more to the soft left in recent years, despite previously being holding various positions within the Blair and Brown governments. But nevertheless, he does seem to be, like Keir Starmer, a kind of quite opportunistic, chameleon-like figure, has some convictions and I suppose rough political impulses in the same way that Keir Starmer had around international law. Andy Burnham, you could say, has that around the questions of devolution or what have you. But beyond that, it is just sort of Keir Starmer in a pair of jeans. And I do think that even when people are trying to make the case for him, it's on purely the grounds of his, not even just character, but just his personality. He's quite a nice bloke. He can communicate well. People like him when they meet him. I do think that if we're talking about someone running the country, particularly in the quite torrid times in which we live, being a nice guy doesn't seem to be enough of an answer. But yes, we wait with bated breath to see how quickly the wheels come off. But I am struck by just how the sort of unanimity of the excitement about him and how that really doesn't seem to measure up, at least in my mind, to the substance of the man, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. It's as though the media have really colluded in this myth of creating Andy Burnham. They've kind of credulously echoed this sort of fiction of Manchesterism, and if they've repeated enough times, then
it becomes real.
It will become real. Claire, what are your thoughts on the impending coronation of Andy Burnham?
So, just on the subject of North Korea, the thing that really, really made me squirm was actually the final Prime Minister's questions with Keir Starmer. I mean, what was that about? I mean, all that kind of standing ovation. These are MPs who have basically just stabbed the Prime Minister in the back and are bringing in another, Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, with, as you say, huge support. And yet they were standing up saying what a marvellous, fantastic person he was. And he says he'd leave the country in a better place than it was before, and everybody cheers. And you think the country hated him. I mean, this is like sort of you talk about feeling like you're being gaslit. And everybody has commended Kemi Badenoch for her very, comradely and, civil way of dealing with things. And, that's fine. But there was something a little bit icky about it all. It just felt so faux. And especially when they shared that joke about, Nigel Farage and Camp Bin face. It just, and it's like sort of we grown-up politicians, we appear to argue here, but really we've got real respect for each other. And I thought, well, I'm sorry, but this isn't just like a show. It's like talking about bread and circuses. So I hated that. Anyway, Andy Burnham, his maiden speech was a really heartfelt, passionate maiden speech in relation to the Hillsborough Law and public accountability, and was very hardcore on the great miscarriages of justice, and the state had done people wrong, and he reeled off a whole range of terribly shocking cases like the infected blood scandal, as well as Hillsborough, and the veterans exposed to nuclear radiation, all sorts of things like that, right? Really kind of quite moving, and you thought this is why people really like him. But what can we say about that? This isn't necessarily the most courageous thing that anyone has ever said. He didn't mention the grooming gang scandal, just as an aside, as the mayor of Greater Manchester until recently. Didn't kind of list that. It was a speech which didn't deal with any difficult issues, and everyone's saying how marvellous it was. Let's see when he has the power of the state at his fingertips, whether he's going to be quite so enthusiastic about a duty to candour, right? A duty of candour, because it's slightly more complicated than that. And I think that just about sums it up for me, that he's able to inhabit a popular space when it's popular. That's not the same as having the courage to make unpopular decisions. And so we just don't know. The other thing that he's managed to do this week, I mean, apart from his evasion in general of accountability, he even had a hustings with his own MPs via Zoom, and didn't have any sort of accountability to the parliamentary house by, they got rid of they refused to accept the motion by the Tories for an extra day before recess that would have allowed at least a teeny bit of scrutiny. Was that he did actually do a big media interview with Gary Lineker. Gary bloody Lineker. And the clips which are obviously doing the rounds are about Gaza, and Lineker is able to share his vast international experience on the question by talking about genocide, Israel and genocide, and Andy Burnham was able to reiterate in heartfelt tones the mistakes that have been made in relation to the terrible way that the Labour Party handled refusing or taking too long, calling for a ceasefire, not condemning Israel, and so on and so forth. And you just thought, this is it's banal, predictable, mainstream, not serious. That's what I thought, and I think that's where I feel about it. I in a way, I don't wish him ill. It would be nice to imagine that somebody might run the country competently. There is nothing as yet that has indicated that is the case. The great enthusiasm is about having this office in number 10, which, by the way, we should note that this is not devolution. This is about giving more power to the Prime Minister's office by having two offices, one in Manchester and one in London, right? It's just not devolution. It's just like a physical other office. It's actually less localized power, but a kind of geographical sleight of hand to pretend that you're closer to the people. So I'm afraid I'm a bit pessimistic, but we'll see.
I loved it how he said in that podcast that he did with Gary Lineker, he was asked about how he would handle Trump. And he said, well, I've got some personality, so I'll meet him where he's at. And
there we go.
Yeah. It doesn't fill you with confidence.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And I think we're in for a lot of quite cringy moments as we go forward. It will certainly be an upgrade on Keir Starmer, a man with all of the charm of a breeze block. But nevertheless, I think this idea that purely because he can speak like a human being, we should all be terribly impressed is going to wear thin pretty quick.
Yeah, I know. You think that they would learn from their mistakes last time. Don't get too excited. Don't put all of your eggs in one basket. It will inevitably lead to disappointment. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Claire. And please stick around for the Spiked podcast Unlocked.
It was authoritarian beyond our wildest dreams. I mean, it really was a disgraceful demonstration of a power-mad administration that they turned on the people.
It does make you think, going back to Andy Burnham for a second, that you're going to have the same problem. There might be occasions where they're drag kicking and screaming into doing something remotely sensible. There might be a bit a shift in the rhetoric.
Thank you so much for watching the Spike podcast. We'll be back next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the Spike podcast, then why not check out what else our channel has to offer, from our documentaries to our weekly interviews and podcasts like The Brendan O'Neill Show. And if you're a Spike supporter, you can watch the second half of this episode by logging in on the Spiked website. If you're not yet a Spike supporter, then why not sign up now? You'll get unlimited access to the website, ad-free reading, discounted tickets to our events, and so much more. So become a Spike supporter today by going to spiked-online.com/support. That's spiked-online.com/support.